Okay, look at this huge group here. Oh, hello, folks. Hi. I love seeing some faces here. Hey. So as we wait for people to stream in because we have a whole load of people registered here, excited for our closing keynote. Just going to give it a minute before I give an introduction and then hand it over to our keynote speaker. Trying to see if maybe there would be a lull in the waiting room, but people just keep streaming in. Okay, here we go. All right. So, welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us for the closing keynote of this year's Well-Being Week in Law. And I hope folks have tuned in to some of the programming that's been offered. I know a lot of it has been recorded and will be available, and we'll post that on our website. And there'll be I think there's recordings from Mindfulness in Law Society, including Institute Lawyer Wellbeing, and also Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, and also some of the bar associations, including the Mass Bar Association and the Boston Bar Association, and we have other local bar associations I know that have been doing wonderful programming this week. I think, this week has really been an opportunity, I hope, for people to pause and reflect and reconnect and recommit to building a healthier and more sustainable legal profession. So, our theme this week of 2026 was Tending Joy, which I think reminds us that well-being, it's not just about reducing distress or burnout, which it certainly is, but it's also about intentionally cultivating the conditions that allow people and communities to thrive. And it's especially meaningful, I will say, to close the week with someone whose work very powerfully bridges research, practical application, and also human connection. So today, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Catherine Sanderson, who is a nationally recognized psychologist, speaker, and author whose work focuses on happiness, resilience, emotional intelligence, moral courage, and creating healthier communities and workplaces. She's the Polar Family Professor of Psychology at Amherst College and has spoken to audiences around the world across corporate, healthcare, education, and nonprofit settings. She's the author of The Positive Shift and Why We Act, the creator of the widely popular Introduction to Psychology course for the Greater Courses, and her TEDx talk on psychology of inaction has helped countless people think differently about courage and leadership and speaking up in difficult moments. And I think one thing that I especially appreciate about her work is the ability to translate the science, the psychological science, into practical, accessible strategies that people can actually use in their everyday lives and work. And I know we talk a lot about that in this work that we do. And I think her approach is very thoughtful and grounded and hopeful and also deeply human, which I think is especially fitting for us and the entire legal profession right now. On a personal note, it is also truly special for me to introduce Catherine, who I have trouble calling her Catherine. She will always be Professor Sanderson to me because she was actually my psychology professor at Amherst College as an undergrad. So it feels very full circle to now welcome her as the closing keynote speaker for Wellbeing Week in Law. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Sanderson. And the last just administrative item I will say is that she will take questions at the end. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat and then we will have a conversation at the end. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Heidi. I really appreciate it. So, about 15 years ago, I gave a talk on the science of happiness at a big financial services conference in Orlando, in which people had the opportunity to go to hear different speakers, in a series of breakout sessions. So, a woman came to my talk on the science of happiness, and at the end, she walked up to me and said, "Thank you so much. You were great. I loved you." And then she paused and said, "And in all honesty, I nearly skipped your session because I just figured that I would hate you." And I said, "Well, thank you for that unusual compliment. And may I ask, why did you assume you would hate me?" And she said, "Well, I just figured that anyone who talked about the science of happiness would be all about like kittens and rainbows, and you'd just be really irritating. And by the end of the hour, I would want to strangle you, and I don't. So thank you so much." And I now start this talk with that story because it actually really illustrates something important. And that is that there are people in the world, and presumably people listening right now on this Zoom, who are the kittens and rainbows people, who can always find some magical silver lining. And if you're one of those people, congratulations. And this talk is going to be a wonderful affirmation of all of the different things that you are doing very well in your life already. But here's the reality. I'm not one of those people. I'm someone who often struggles to find happiness. I'm someone who comes from a pretty long line of a family history of people who have struggled with issues of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, bipolar disorder. And so I'm someone who understands that happiness for at least some of us is not easy. So I love giving this talk, in part because I love talking about psychology. That will probably be very clear to all of you. But I love it especially because about the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to share specific practical strategies that we can all use to find greater happiness, no matter where we fall on that natural happiness continuum. And none of these are things like sell all your belongings and move to Aruba. But before we get started with the actual content of my talk, I want to do a quick poll, and I'm going to do a couple of these during the course of this talk to just get a sense of where you all are. So I want to ask, and this is totally anonymous, but I want to ask, are you a kittens and rainbows person? And I will say I give this talk regularly. I give it to doctors, I give it to lawyers, I give it to people in the corporate world, I give it to high school students and college students and teachers and senior citizens. And the answer to this poll is always very, very consistent. So I'm going to share the data from you all, but let me just tell you, it's not going to be just data from lawyers that I'm going to reference. So over 60% of you have already participated, which is great. And I am let me give you about 5 more seconds. We've hit over 70% right now, which is wonderful. So if you want to get your response in, I'm going to count you down from 5 seconds, and then I am going to turn off the poll and share their answers. So if you want to get your response in, last chance in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we hit 76%. I know some people are still just joining and may not have any idea what this poll actually is. But so here are the results. So 65% of you would say no, 35% of you would say yes. And let me just say, actually, this is a pretty high number of yeses. That typically It's more like 15, 20% of people are kittens and rainbows people. So you are actually a little bit higher, perhaps, than normal. Maybe people who choose to come to a talk on the science of happiness or participate in a lawyer's well-being week. But here's the key. I have never, not one time, done this talk and asked this question and not had most people be not the kittens and rainbows people. And so again, 65% of you are not. And that again is very standard. So, before I start talking about the science of happiness and what does make us happy, I want to talk about the mistakes that we make. Because one of the challenges is that many people are interested in being happy, but we often look for happiness in the wrong places. And so, I want to start by talking about what the data tells us about things that we think will make us happy, but in reality, we're wrong. And before I start sharing it, I want you to just, without looking at anybody else's response, put a word or phrase in the chat room about what you think is the number one mistake that people make in terms of thinking something will make them happy, but in reality, it does not. So I'll stop talking for a minute. Don't look at anybody else's answers. Just type what's the number one mistake that you think people make. And I'm not going to wait for all 90 of you to give a response, but I will just give it a minute. And overwhelmingly, lots and lots of answers have come in, and overwhelmingly, you all are right on the money, haha. And that is that money, overwhelmingly. I took a quick scan, and the first 10 people said money or buying stuff or possessions, things like that, and that's overwhelmingly true. The biggest mistake that people make in terms of thinking that something will make them happy, and in reality, it doesn't, is about money. Now, sometimes I give this talk in a big room in person, and I say, what's the biggest mistake? And most people will call out money. That's the answer that most people give. Periodically, someone yells like marriage, and it's like super awkward if they're there with their spouse. But yes, money is the number one mistake that people make. So this is a picture of Tiger Woods' house, or maybe now Tiger Woods' ex-wife's house, and we think, gosh, if I lived in a house like that, wouldn't I be happier every single minute of every single day? But the reality is, we adjust pretty quickly to new wealth. So we think we'll be happier once we have more money, we get more money, and then we adjust to that level and think, well, if I just had a little bit more money after that. And this is a principle that psychologists call hedonic adaptation, or the hedonic treadmill. You might have heard that term as well. And this is a long-standing belief that people have had about the challenge of looking for happiness in money. As Benjamin Franklin said, money has never made man happy. There is nothing in its power, in its nature, to produce happiness. The more of it one has, the more one wants. And that's really the challenge of adaptation. We think we'll be happy when we get a little more, we get a little more, and then we adapt to that new level. And this doesn't just work in terms of money, it works in terms of lots of different things. So many of us can think about the excitement of getting our very first cell phone. Now, depending on your age, that cell phone might have been able to just call people. That was true for me. Maybe you can recognize your first cell phone in that picture. So for me, I'm on the far left. It looked kind of like a walkie-talkie. For some of you, you have no idea what that image is. But I was very excited when I got my first cell phone because all of a sudden I could call people from the car. It was incredibly exciting. The older people on this call will know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, for younger people, they're like, what do you mean you could only just call people from the car? That's what the initial cell phones did, but it was very exciting. Now, if you were to take my current cell phone and give me my first cell phone, I would be very sad because we now expect our cell phones not to just let us call people from the car, but also let us shoot a movie, buy a dress, read a book, et cetera. And that's the challenge of adaptation. Now, before I go on, I want to say one really important thing, and that is that for people living below the poverty line, for people who are struggling with day in and day out survival, more money actually does lead to increased happiness. And empirical research has shown this. And that's probably because having more money reduces stress. If you have a car that breaks down and you don't have enough money to buy a new car, then you can no longer get to work or get your kids to school. If you have plenty of money, it's no big deal. You just rent a car while it's getting fixed, or you buy a new car, et cetera. And so it's not the case that money never can make us happy, but it is the case that money has a limited effect on happiness, and that's by and large because money does help people that are really struggling with survival. So, what else do we think makes us happy, but it really doesn't? Lots of data suggests that people have a strong belief that climate matters. Boy, if I lived in a warmer, prettier climate, surely I would be happier, every single day. I'm giving this talk from Massachusetts, where it's actually surprisingly cold today in May. And many people think, well, if I just lived in a warmer, prettier climate, I would be happier all the time. If you ask large scale surveys of Americans, would you be happier if you lived in California or North Dakota? Pretty much everybody says California. And that belief actually forms the basis of a joke I tell my students in my health psychology class. So here's the joke. A patient goes to a doctor, and the doctor says, I have terrible news. You have 6 months to live. And the patient says, well, that is terrible news. And what do you suggest I do? And the doctor says, you should immediately move to North Dakota. And the patient says, absolutely, I'll do that right away. And if I move to North Dakota, will I live longer? And the doctor says, no, but it'll feel like forever. Now, I have given this talk 3 times in which somebody from North Dakota has been in the audience. And believe you me, they do not appreciate this joke. But this joke is actually not based in reality. A Gallup poll a few years ago found that North Dakota is one of the top 5 happiest states. California is not. So, in fact, people in North Dakota are very happy. They have adjusted to the climate and it's no longer impacting their mood. People in California have also adapted to the warm and prettier climate, and it's no longer giving them the same boost, just like we saw with better cell phone or a raise. Another key thing people anticipate will make them happy: life events. I will be happy when. And many of us have said this at some point. I will be happy when this thing happens. So that could be, I will be happy when I graduate from high school, when I graduate from college. It could be, I will be happy when I get a job. I will be happy when I buy a house. I will be happy when I get married, when I have a baby, when I retire. When this thing happens, then I will be happy. And the problem is, we also adapt to life events in the same kind of way. So you anticipate, I will be happy once I get a promotion. So you work harder and harder and harder to get that promotion. You get that promotion, and as it turns out, you actually have to do that job. And that job has pressure and deadlines and colleagues. And the permanent happiness you thought was yours, it's not there. But there's one kind of life event that's a little bit more nuanced in terms of its effect on happiness, and that's the life event of becoming a parent. So this is a little bit of an outdated picture of my 3 kids who are now all in their 20s. But overwhelmingly, we have this expectation in society that becoming a parent surely will be very rewarding. But the day in and day out experience of parenthood for many people is actually really hard. I gave this talk once a number of years ago, and I got to the slide and I said, the reality day in and day out of parenting is, and I paused, and a woman right in the front row yelled out, hell. And it echoed like hell, 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 through the ballroom. Now, in fairness, this woman had a 2-year-old at home. But the challenge is that the day in, day out experience of parenthood it's not all happiness inducing. It's playing lots of really boring games with no strategy. It's doing huge amounts of laundry. It's literally touching somebody else's poop. And as the author Anne Lamott says, having a baby is like suddenly getting the world's worst roommate. So, what does the data on the science of happiness and parenthood say? And this data is fascinating. So, one, and this probably won't be surprising to many people here, fathers tend to get more joy out of parenthood than do mothers. Probably lots of complex reasons for that. I'm glad to talk more about that in the Q&A also at the end. But we also know that the age of the child matters. That people who are parenting very young kids, birth to 5, experience it as, pretty stressful. Parents of teenagers also experience it as pretty stressful. As the author Nora Ephron once wrote, when your children are teenagers, it's really important to have a dog so that when you get home, somebody will be happy to see you. And I remember this very well, parenting teenagers. So, what's the sweet spot? The sweet spot is kids ages of about 5 to 12. Kids who still like you, they're not teenagers, but they're old enough to be able to dress themselves, use the bathroom, feed themselves, et cetera. So, that sort of 5 to 12 spot is when parents report the most joy. Now, periodically, I'll give one of these talks and someone will put in the chat or come up to me afterwards and they'll say, but Catherine, you have to remember, if you have children, you might get grandchildren, and grandchildren make me very happy. And let me just say, I am holding out hope that that eventually, will be true and that there will be a payoff for what has been some considerable time of not complete happiness and joy. All right. So thus far, I've spent this whole talk talking about what doesn't make us happy. And the good news is there's actually lots of empirical research looking at the opposite. What does make us happy? And the good news is many of the things that make us happy are relatively simple, low level behaviors. So, one of the most consistent findings is that eating makes us happy. Now, that's not the most surprising thing you're going to hear today, but it's not just eating like the act of chewing, swallowing, it's eating particular kinds of foods. So, what kinds of foods make us happy? Sugars, sweets, fats, carbohydrates. There's absolutely no evidence for happiness and, say, celery, for example. Now, fortunately, there's also lots of data on the link between happiness and exercise. Raise your actual or virtual hand if you've heard about the link between exercise, endorphins, and happiness. This is covered, pretty regularly in the popular press. So often a lot of audience members, have heard about this, and I'm seeing lots and lots of hands here. And so, yeah, the link between endorphins and happiness is very consistent. While we exercise, it actually makes us chemically feel better, increases endorphins in our body, and that makes us happy while we're exercising and also afterwards. And as I often say, one of the very best feelings we can have is the feeling of having exercised. And unfortunately, the only way you can get the having exercise feeling, you have to exercise first. It's really too bad. Now, we often know from empirical research that shopping makes people happy, but it's actually much more interesting than you might imagine. And that is that the very best kind of shopping in terms of inducing happiness is shopping when we find a gift for someone else. And so, what the research shows is that it's not shopping, acquiring things that makes us happy. It's actually about shopping relationship building. One of the best feelings we can have in terms of a behavior is shopping and finding the perfect gift for someone we care about. And I'll talk more about that at the end of my talk today. Now, I started this talk by saying, who are the kittens and rainbows people? And I think about 35% of you are the kittens and rainbows people. And the reality is that about 50% of our happiness is determined by our personality. And that really does mean that some people, the kittens and rainbows people, have a head start on finding happiness. Happiness is easier for them. So, what about personality predicts happiness? And there are three really consistent findings in the literature. One, people who are extroverted, people who are outgoing, they like to do new things, meet new people. They probably have an easier time finding and forming a social network. So extroversion is one. Two, high in self-esteem. They feel good about themselves. Here's a cartoon that shows the opposite. Dear diary, sorry to bother you again. And people who are high in self-esteem, when things go poorly for them, they don't get down about it. They sort of think, oh, I'm going to pick myself up, things, work out, et cetera. So they probably are better able to buffer negative experiences. And the third factor, which is the one that I think for many people is the most salient and most impactful, and that is optimism. People who are optimistic are very, very good at anticipating only positive outcomes. Freud told a story about a couple who came to see him in therapy. And at some point during the course of the therapy session, the husband turned to the wife and said, if one of us were to die, I think I would go live in Paris because of course, if it's one of us, it'd be you. I have this, Paris plan. My oldest child has a remarkable ability to do this kind of optimistic thinking. When Andrew started high school, he had been in public school from kindergarten through eighth grade. In ninth grade, he moved to an elite prep school, boarding school, that he was woefully underprepared for in basically every possible dimension. But he struggled, especially in Spanish. And he struggled enough in Spanish that midway through his first trimester, he received a grade of 50. And this is a school that uses the traditional 1 to 100 grading scale. So 50 was really not good. So in November, Andrew calls me and says, Mom, I got my fall trimester grades for Spanish and it's good news. And I said, oh, thank goodness, because I was, really worried what with, 50 in October. And he goes, yeah, it's good news. And I said, great, what'd you get? And he goes, I got a 58. And I said, that is not good news. And he goes, no, it's 8 points higher than I had in October. And I said, you got an F. You got an F in Spanish. And he said, Mom, it's really an F plus. And I said, I'm a professor. Like there is no plus on the F. Like that's not even an option. And he said, well, at the rate I'm going, I'm going to have a 66 in January. And I said, that's also not good. That's a D. But the good news about Andrew is that by all accounts, someday he's probably going to be prison, hopefully not a Spanish speaking prison, but he's going to be fine because he's going to be like, I've got a roommate, I've got this bunk bed, there's this exercise yard. They bring the meals in through the door 3 times a day. It's so relaxing. Because anybody who can call home with the good news of the F plus, he's going to be happy. He might be poor, living in my basement, but he's going to be happy. And this ability to find the silver lining no matter what is tremendously important. And one of my favorite quotes that illustrates this finding is by Nelson Mandela. I am fundamentally an optimist. Whether that comes from nature or nurture, I cannot say. Part of being optimistic is keeping one's head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. And in what is really important for all of us is that our ability to find some kind of silver lining seems to increase with age. And I'm now going to show you some data, and this is actually recently collected data on the link between age and happiness. And so I'm showing you this data in twofold. One, I want you to start by looking at the blue line because the blue line is what has traditionally been true in the field of positive psychology. And we call this the inverted U. And the inverted U finding has been very, very consistent across cultures, across time. And that is that people tend to be happy in their sort of young adult years. Then there is a drop in happiness at around age 50. This, of course, corresponds with the midlife crisis period. It's also an age at which many people have teenagers living in their home. And then, really importantly, happiness increases for people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They've studied people up to about age 85. So this inverted U with a drop at around midlife has been very, very consistent. Now, what you can see in the yellow line, and this is why I've added this new data, is that post-COVID, as you've probably heard, teenagers, young adults are really struggling. And so the happiness for people in young adulthood is actually much lower than it has been historically. And we don't know if that's going to even out or if that's, a fundamental change. And obviously there may be multiple factors that contribute. But what's important for the scope of this talk is that even the yellow line shows the same increase among people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that part of the increase in happiness with age finding is still empirically true today as it has been historically. And to examine, well, what explains this increase in happiness for people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, researchers have done qualitative interviews. And what they have found is very, very consistent across time and across culture. And that is that people in their younger years tend to be very focused on having a big social network, what I often call Facebook friends. And what people tend to do in their 60s, 70s, and 80s is they get rid of the riffraff. They have a smaller number of social networks, but they have relationships with people who they care about and who care about them. So they are choosing quality over quantity. Or as this quote says, as we grow up, we realize it is less important to have lots of friends and more important to have real ones. And this is really the most fundamentally important finding for me about the science of happiness. And that is that it's not about having big social networks. It's about having a small number of people in your life who you can really count on, who you care about and who they care about you. I want to now talk just briefly about some key conclusions from the field of positive psychology before I give you the practical takeaway tips. And so, one of these is that genes matter. I started today by asking, who are the kittens and rainbows people? And the power of genes suggests that about half of our happiness is in fact encoded in our genes, probably through personality, extroversion, optimism, self-esteem. And that's one of the reasons why some people have a head start in finding happiness. It's also one of the reasons why short-term things like better climate, better cell phone, more money don't have such a lasting impact on happiness. As this cartoon says, I could cry when I think of the years I wasted accumulating money, only to learn that my cheerful disposition is genetic. And so this is why some people have a head start on happiness, and it's also why we adapt to things like more money, better climate, better cell phone. But here's what I take as the most important finding. 50% of our happiness is encoded in our genes. That means 50% isn't. So for those of us, 65% of us, present company included, who are not the kittens and rainbows people, 50% of your happiness is up to you. It's not encoded for in your genes. And so there are specific things you can do to change your happiness. Two, I've talked today throughout about the power of adaptation. And what I've said is, yeah, it's a bummer. You adapt to better climate, a raise, a promotion, better climate, better cell phone, whatever. It's a bad thing. But here is why it's important. We adapt to the good things, winning the lottery, sudden windfall, but we adapt to the bad things as well. And I'm now going to tell you a really hard story. And again, given the audience of this talk in the Northeast, for many people, this is probably a familiar story, but it's the story of the family of Dr. William Pettit. This is a family living in a small town in Connecticut a few years ago, husband, wife, two girls, when one night, two men who'd recently been released from prison broke into their home. They tied up the dad in the basement. They tied the mom and two girls to their beds. And they then proceeded to sexually assault all three of them. The girls were ages 11 and 17. Then, to hide evidence of their crimes, the men set the house on fire. The dad was able to escape from the basement. He had a head injury, but he lived. But the mom and both girls died of smoke inhalation. And for most of us, when we hear that story, it seems impossible to imagine that he could find happiness again. He's lost his wife. He's lost both of his girls. And he didn't just lose them, he lost them in about the most horrific set of circumstances that we can wrap our minds around. And that sort of level of tragedy seems impossible to bear. And yet, a few years after that tragedy, he met a woman who volunteered as for the foundation he established to honor his family's memory. She volunteered as a photographer. Over time, they became friends. They fell in love and they were married. His first wife's family attended their wedding and said, "We're so happy you found somebody to share your life with again." And a few years later, they welcomed a little boy. So that doesn't mean that he's the same happy, but what it does mean is the power of the human spirit allows us, enables us to find happiness again, even if we've experienced great loss and great tragedy. And finally, the most important lesson I take from these key conclusions is that for those of us who are not naturally predisposed to find happiness, happiness involves effort. You got to decide that you want to be happy, you deserve to be happy, and that you are willing to structure your life in ways that help you find that happiness. As the author Elizabeth Gilbert so eloquently writes, happiness is the consequence of personal effort. You fight for it, strive for it, insist upon it, and sometimes even travel around the world looking for it. You have to participate relentlessly in the manifestations of your own blessings. And once you have achieved a state of happiness, you must never become lax about maintaining it. You must make a mighty effort to keep swimming upward into that happiness forever, to stay afloat on top of it. And I now want to do one more just very quick poll. I have given you three sort of key conclusions. These are all, key findings within the field of positive psychology. But I'm always just interested to see, what are your key takeaways? And so I've talked about the power of genes, that some people have a head start. I've talked about the power of adaptation, that even when really difficult things happen, we can find happiness again. And I've talked about the power of exerting effort, that we all have a role in choosing to be happier and structuring our lives accordingly. So again, there's no right answer here. I'm just always interested in seeing what are your takeaways. And so I'll just give you a minute and I'll stop talking to see what are your takeaways. And I will say even very, very quickly, there were people who were responding in all ways, um, all different responses. And we have over 66% of people participating. And again, I'll just give you another, 5 seconds or so because I want to make sure that I leave time for Q&A. We've had over 70%. So I'm going to give you 5 more seconds and then I'm going to shut this poll. If you want to get your response in, now's the time. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So the number one big response, and maybe this is again because a lot of us are not kittens and rainbows people, was 52% of people said power of effort. But again, you see about a third of people said power of adaptation, and 13% of people said power of genes. Maybe those are the kittens and rainbows people. All right. So as promised, I am going to end by giving you 10 strategies. And I'm giving 10 because every time I give this talk, I have three goals. One, I want you to learn something that you didn't know when I started. I'm assuming that I'm talking to a group of, smart, thoughtful, well-read people. I still want you to have learned something you didn't know when this started. Two, I want you to have enjoyed the experience. Sometimes when people hear a professor will be talking, they're not exactly like super excited. But three, and this is my big one, I want everyone to have learned at least one specific practical thing that you can do differently in your life moving forward. And so I'm giving 10 because different strategies are going to resonate with different people. I have this photograph of a bungee jumper for a reason, and that is that there is nothing that I can imagine being worse than being,
Right.
jumping over a giant
Science.
bridge. And in fact, the bungee
We're
jumping.
totally on the same page. I don't, Effie, I do not,
And
I just want to
I
make
think,
sure, don't walk away from this with there
I
being
think
any.
maybe we should mute people who are not me. Great, thank you. And so for me, I can't imagine anything worse than this, but I know for other people, this is like, oh, exciting. I would love to pay, in order to have this opportunity. So I'm giving 10 because different strategies are going to resonate with different people who are listening right now. All right, one, change your behavior. I talked about a lot of these different examples before, but there are low-level things that we can do in our lives that, in fact, the data shows strongly influence happiness. Getting enough sleep. Raise your hand if you get enough sleep. Raise your virtual or actual hand if you get enough sleep. I'm not seeing that many hands. All right, let's put hands down. That was a very small number of hands. Who makes a point of exercising regularly? Let's do hands again. And pretty regularly, I will say when I do this, I get far more hands for the exercise question than I do for the sleep question. And let me just point out, sleeping, it's actually easier than exercising. Just keep that in mind. Three, read a book. Anyone here make a point of reading books regularly? There's in fact particular evidence for reading fiction. Reading in general is good, but reading fiction is particularly good. Glad to talk more about the why in the Q&A. So either think about it or put a note in a question in the chat, and I will get to those questions at the end. So these are three easy things: sleeping, exercise, reading a book. All of these, there is strong empirical evidence lead to increased happiness. Also, in fact, some evidence for better health as well. Two, does anyone here meditate? Let's do a quick show of hands about meditation. Lots of evidence suggests if you don't do this one already, this is cheap, this is easy. Evidence, in fact, looking at fMRI data, so neuroscience research, some of it being done at Mass General, shows that meditation is not just good for happiness and health, it also makes you kinder. And again, glad to talk more about the nerdy science in the Q&A for anyone who's particularly interested. But if you don't meditate already, this is cheap, it's easy, and the data is really strong. Three, spend time in nature. Lots of evidence suggests that spending time in nature is beneficial for both health and happiness. One of the earliest studies that was done on this topic actually found that people who simply had a hospital room overlooking nature recovered faster from surgery than people whose hospital room overlooked a parking lot. fMRI data has brought in people and has shown them different images. Here are two actual images shown in the study, and they've looked at patterns of brain activity in response to visually appealing images, but comparing urban city skylines to rural nature scenes. And what that data shows is that when you're looking at even a very pretty picture, colors, sky, clouds, water, etc., of an urban city skyline, your brain is really active. It's firing, it's active, you're processing, you're engaged. When you show people in an fMRI machine a picture of a rural nature scene, the brain is relaxed and it's calm, like you're meditating or sleeping. And that may be why it's easier for people to recover from surgery when looking at nature. And this does not mean you have to move to, Wyoming or North Dakota. Data has shown that even being in an urban city and being in a green setting within that space, a park, is in fact beneficial in terms of happiness and blood pressure. So it doesn't mean move to North Dakota, but it does mean make a point of finding little spots of nature, when you can on a regular basis. 4, focus on the good. Many people have a tendency to try to go to sleep at night. Maybe this is why people don't sleep so well, thinking about their to-do list and the problems they're facing. And what research has shown is focusing on the good in your life, the things that you are grateful for, establishing a gratitude practice is in fact really beneficial. I started something at the beginning of 2026 in which every Saturday I post on Instagram 3 good things, 3 small good things that have happened to me in the last week. And that is my gratitude practice. I find 3 good things, and they can be very small, that I feel good about. And now I have this, record of 3 good things, and I'm also modeling that behavior for other people. And the key when you're focusing on the good is they have to be things that are right now, not things that will be in the future. As Dale Carnegie said, one of the most tragic things I know about human nature is that all of us tend to put off living. We are all dreaming of some magical rose garden over the horizon instead of enjoying the roses that are blooming outside our windows today. So when you do the gratitude practice, it's not things I'll be grateful for once I retire, once I get a raise, once I move to Florida. It's things you're grateful for right now. 5, make a gratitude visit. And this is an idea that came from a professor at Penn, Martin Seligman. And what he has people do is to write someone a letter telling them what they meant to them. Could be a teacher, a mentor, a boss, a neighbor. And then you travel to that person and you read the letter aloud. And the key is that most of us wait until the eulogy to do this. So the idea here is don't wait for the eulogy. Do it now. 6, smile, even when you aren't happy. This is the fake it till you make it idea. A fascinating study brought in people, had them hold chopsticks in their teeth in one of 3 facial expressions. Then while you held this expression, you put your hand in a bucket of freezing cold ice water. And what they found was that people holding a big beaming smile, the far left on your screen, actually held their hand in the water significantly longer, suggesting that smiling, the mere act of smiling, changes how your body responds to pain. So fake it till you make it. Smiling actually leads you to feel happier. 7, give anything to anyone. And this is one of my favorites because basically everything counts. People who volunteer in their communities, higher levels of happiness. People who donate to charity, higher levels of happiness. Every country there, colored in green, there's a positive correlation between charitable giving and happiness. So again, it's a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just Western culture, United States. Again, data looking at fMRI data has shown that if you just think about giving a gift to a friend, it activates a particular part of your brain that is the exact same part of your brain that is activated when you think about rewarding things, such as eating chocolate. Also the part of the brain that is activated when you use cocaine, but that's not the best example. 8, spend money wisely. I started today by saying, yeah, there's no link between, money and happiness, but the reality is we can spend money in better and worse ways. And some people, in fact, already alluded to this in the very first question I asked you to put in the chat. Best way to spend money? Spending it on experiences. Travel, tickets to the big game, concert, play, whatever, spa day. Spending money on experiences lets you experience the thing, lets you reflect back on it, lets you anticipate it. So it increases happiness in a long way. What doesn't bring us more happiness? Belongings, expensive watch, shoes, car, purse. As nobody says on their deathbed, I should have bought more crap. As philosopher Roger Corliss says, trying to be happy by accumulating possessions is like trying to satisfy hunger by taping sandwiches all over your body. Does not bring happiness. Nine, avoid comparisons. And for many people, happiness is easy to find right up until you start comparing to other people around you. As this cartoon says, I do count my blessings, but then I end up counting those of others who have more and better blessings, and that pisses me off. As Teddy Roosevelt famously said, comparison is the thief of joy. And for many people these days, this element of comparison is kind of in our faces all the time on social media, or as I like to call, fake book. Uh, Finally, last but not least, build and maintain relationships. Single best predictor of our happiness, but we don't get good relationships without investing time and energy and effort and conflict and compromise. I use this picture as a metaphor that if you look at a dancer on point from a distance, it looks easy, effortless, magical. But if you actually get yourself on point, your feet are bloodied and bruised and calloused. And that's precisely what the research shows about relationships. And my final quote for you today perfectly illustrates this finding, and it's by Tolstoy. But on entering upon family life, he saw at every step that it was utterly different from what he had imagined. At every step, he experienced what a man would experience who, after admiring the smooth, happy course of a little boat on a lake, should get himself into that little boat. He saw that it was not all sitting still, floating smoothly, that one had to think too, not for an instant to forget where one was floating, and that there was water under one, and that one must row, and that his unaccustomed hands would be sore, and that it was only to look at it that was easy, but that doing it, though very delightful, was very difficult. And that's precisely what the research shows. Building and maintaining relationships are the single best predictor of our happiness, but we don't get those relationships without investing time and energy and effort and conflict and compromise. And my final poll for you today, before we go to Q&A, which is always my favorite part, I want to see what resonated with you. And this poll, unlike the other ones, is multiple choice, so you can choose as many as you want. Remember to scroll down to see all the different options. But this is, again, different things that we have talked about and what resonates with you. Be thinking about your questions because I will turn it over to Q&A after this. Look forward to seeing your responses. And over 50% of people have already participated. And again, somebody has selected all of the different ones so far. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to shut the poll soon. So if you want to get your response in, go ahead and do so. We've already hit over 70% of people participating. So if you want to get your response in, and again, you can choose as many as you want here. I'm going to stop the poll in 5 seconds. And we are at 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And we got to 79%. And I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results. And I'm just going to scan. So the number one thing, 64% of people said spend time in nature. That was the number one response. 60% of people said focus on the good, and 59% of people said build and maintain relationships. And my final slide is of my lovely dogs. And I show this slide because people overwhelmingly, it's the number one question I get asked. How about pets? Lots of data shows that pets do increase happiness. And that's in part because pets provide unconditional love. You don't have to do the time, the energy, the effort, the conflict, the compromise. And glad to talk about dogs. Thank you all so much for listening. Looking forward to talking Q&A right now. I will also say I am easy to find. And if you have questions that we don't have time for today, or you don't want to ask in a group setting, it's totally fine to just send me an email. If people are interested in more content, I have an absolutely free Substack called How to Feel Better. A lot of the research that I've talked about today is from my book, The Positive Shift, available on Audible and independent bookstores and Amazon. And I talk regularly about happiness, health, psychology, and dogs on Instagram at Sanderson Speaking. So thank you all so much for listening. And I think Heidi is going to moderate our Q&A. And again, thank you all so much for joining me.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this really powerful talk and just chock full of lots of information and lots of research. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat and I will ask them in the order they come in. So I am going to get started because I see a few in here already and I have some questions. So feel free to just drop them in the chat or send them to me privately. So the first question was around art and whether buying and enjoying art is actually different from just buying stuff that
Oh,
doesn't make you happier.
yeah. So first of all, I love that question. I'm actually working on a new talk on the link between art. I'm doing it for a museum on the link between art and happiness. So this is a topic that's in my mind. So I will say two things. One, there's lots of data suggesting that creating art, so actually producing it, painting or sculpting or whatever, predicts happiness. And I think that I don't know of research that has actually looked specifically at buying art, but I think one of the keys is that when you are doing things that are an experience, it increases happiness. So to the extent that shopping for art means you are anticipating going to galleries, or I'm giving this talk actually looking at two paintings that were gifts to me from my mom, and looking at the paintings reminds me of my mom, reminds me of my mom's house. Many people collect ceramics or Christmas ornaments or whatever, on trips, and so therefore what you're doing is saying it's not just this piece of art, it's this piece of art from when we were in Cairo or Athens or whatever. And so to the extent that it's an experience, the data would strongly suggest that buying art does. And love that question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But I will move to our next question, and this is a really important one, especially now. So the question is how people can successfully maintain their own happiness when so many people around us and who we care about in personal and work life are so unhappy or maybe pessimistic.
Yeah, I mean, so that is a question that I get with a fair amount of regularity, and I'll say a couple of things. So one, what the research strongly suggests is that happiness and frankly sadness is contagious. So that our mood is actually influenced by people around us, and that can be better or that can be worse. But one thing I will say is that if there are people in your life who are feeling sad at sort of a regular basis, and you know that being around those people makes you feel sad, try to intentionally build in strategies for lifting your own mood. So I often get a question like, my sister is so negative or whatever. And what I will say is, if you know you're having lunch with your sister, make a plan for immediately after, get a pedicure, watch a funny movie, call a different friend, go for a walk outside, whatever. So I think that's one. I think two, and I can't exactly tell the intent of this question, but I think that if there also are cases in which if there are people who are around you who are really struggling, giving actually makes people happier. And so finding ways of sort of saying, hey, let me help you out can actually be something that helps somebody else and also helps make you better. So if there are people around where you're like, let me lighten the load here, in some way, or let me do something kind, that's a way in which we are giving, but we are also helping somebody else's load. So I'll say, those sort of two things.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Um, So another question we have here is, what is a low cost giveaway that we can provide to members of our legal community to increase their joy and boost well-being? So, I think it sort of goes along with those, those 10 tips you gave us, but any thoughts on sort of low cost, maybe,
Mhm.
easy to do, simple.
Yeah, no. Well, first of all, I love that question, and it's also so practical. So I will say that I do this talk regularly for lots of different groups, and there are lots of groups that have implemented things specifically designed to increase happiness. So one group, and this is actually my publisher, they have a rule in which there are no meetings in the company on Fridays, and that is specifically to give people a chance if they want to take a long weekend, they're not missing something, but b a chance for people to enter the weekend feeling like they've been productive. So that's not feasible. I know for law firms to do that, but that's a way of sort of buying time. I know some organizations have said we're going to allocate, 2 hours a month in which you can, volunteer in your community and have that, be counted towards your work day. So some employers have that kind of flexibility. I know other organizations that have said we're going to have a reading group, and so we're gonna choose a book. We're going to choose a book club. We know that reading is beneficial. We know that it's good for well-being, and so we're going to have that be part of your lunch hour. Many of the things that I talked about here are actually, very small. Some organizations have provided free access as part of the employee health plan to something like Calm or some other kind of an app in which it's encouraging meditation, or an app in which you are encouraged to list your gratitude practice. When I was teaching during COVID, I started every single class with people going around saying one good thing about their week. So you could institute a meeting practice in which everybody shares one joy, one happy. So again, I think there are lots of different ways of taking this data and finding ways to implement it in your life personally and or professionally.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Great thoughts. Moving on to sort of legal education and law students. What are your thoughts on helping, law students in particular, right, especially right now during the grading season, respond to comparisons in the competitive environment of legal education?
Yeah, so I think about that as a lot, and as Heidi knows, I'm actually married to I guess I'll call him a former lawyer, but a person who was a lawyer for many many years. And what I will say is that comparison is all around us, but the challenge is that what we are comparing is, and there's a wonderful quote that I'm not going to say as well as she wrote it by Anne Lamott, which is that we compare ourselves to what other people are presenting on their outsides to our insides. And that means that if people are doing really well with things, they often share. I just ran the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours again. My kid's valedictorian, all this stuff. And when we're struggling, we don't share. And so if academically things are going very well, or you have lots of different options, or you've just made partner, or whatever it is, people talk about it, they brag about it. If things are not going well, you often really struggle. So I try to make a point, and I try to do this regularly on Instagram and in social media in particular, of, writing things like, all of my kids have lice. Because for many, many years, that in fact was the truth. And so I think being more authentic is really, really important. I'm actually very mindful that I'm giving this talk 2 days before Mother's Day. And Mother's Day is a really hard holiday for a lot of people. And it's a hard holiday because of comparison. If you're missing your mom, my mom is no longer living. If you're missing your mom, if you have struggled to have children and have not been able to, if you are estranged from a parent or a child, it can be a really hard day. And so again, that's an example of comparison is the thief of joy. And what helps is being authentic. Mother's Day is really hard for me, and putting that out there. So remember, being real, being authentic is the way in which you get the support you need if things are not going well. And that's true academically, but it's also true much more broadly.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really important point, and something that we stress all the time in the legal profession, normalizing struggles and challenges, and how important that is, particularly for leaders to speak about that. So appreciate that. We have another question around extroversion and extroversion in relation to genetic happiness, and whether it's harder to attain happiness as an introvert, and maybe why. Your
Yeah, no,
thoughts?
that's such an important and sort of high level question. And so here's the thing about the difference between extroverts and introverts. Extroverts put themselves out there. So they cast a very wide net, and that means they are probably more likely to find social networks. Introverts absolutely can find happiness, but the key for introverts is they have to find the right people. Introverts don't need the big social networks. They really need the right people. And so introverts can be happy, but the key for introverts is making sure that they are investing in enough relationships that they find that. But as we talked about, the key about relationships is it's not quantity, it's quality. And so introverts can be focused on saying, I don't need 5,000 friends. I need 3 or 4 really good ones.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Um, Another question on watching TV versus reading and the link between those two and happiness. And you talked about reading, but what about TV and happiness?
Yeah, so there's actually no research that I've read with one, I'm gonna say with one exception that links TV and happiness. And the one exception is rewatching something or watching something that, so a lot of people are like, I watch Friends all the time, or I watch, Two and a Half Men, or, whatever. I watch something that, Cheers, something that's really resonating with me and reminding me of the sort of sentimentality and nostalgia. However, there is strong data on watching movies and happiness. So there is certainly data on movies, and that could be movies, that you stream at home. It doesn't mean going to the theater. But there has not been data that has looked at TV and happiness. And I think that's because when we talk about TV, it can be, you're watching, CNN or Fox News, or you're watching a documentary, you're watching sports, you're watching whatever. And so I think it's just too broad in terms of looking at the link between happiness, but certainly the evidence is clear that looking at movies and happiness is very strong. And by the way, for people who are interested in this, I actually wrote a whole Substack newsletter, I don't know, maybe a year ago at some point, on movies and happiness. And I also did another one looking at being a sports fan and happiness. So for people who like to watch sports, there is also data on watching sports, particularly live, and happiness.
Hmm. Oh, very interesting. So I'm gonna take the opportunity actually to ask one last question, and that's in regards to sort of the constant stimulation and distraction, and particularly in relation to technology, sort of always being on, and what sort of impact that has on happiness and emotional well-being.
Yes, so thanks for that question. And again, when you invite a professor to talk, a professor can talk. So I'm sorry if I've overstayed my welcome. But what the research shows is that overwhelmingly the presence of technology actually interferes with our ability to build substantive, meaningful conversations. There's a fascinating study showing that just the presence of a cell phone on a table draws people's attention, even if the cell phone is turned off. And therefore, we're actually not investing in the real intimate conversations with people that are in our lives. This semester, I just have finished teaching a seminar in close relationships, and for the first time ever, I instituted a new policy, and the policy was no laptops. No laptops. And I said, because it's a class on close relationships. And so laptops, people being on their laptops means you're not actually looking at your classmates. And so for the first time ever, I did it. I loved it. And it's now my new policy. So technology has lots of advantages, but it actually can interfere with our ability to build and maintain relationships, which, as I've described, is the number one predictor of happiness. So I will also just say thank you all so much for listening. If anybody wants a copy of the slide deck, just shoot me an email. I'm very easy to find. If you Google Catherine Sanderson, I come up in like 2 seconds. And I have a website, which is sandersonspeaking.com. You can just put me a note. You can do a note there very quickly. So thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you so much again, for your talk and all these practical evidence-based strategies for us to take away, especially at the end of this week, and sort of things that we can do, things that are within our control and very intentional to impact our happiness. So I would highly recommend folks follow Catherine, particularly on Instagram. She has some great stuff there, great posts and ideas, and very authentic, as she said. And thank you all for tuning in today and taking the time, out of your busy week to spend it here with us. I think, all the folks here, you understand the value of well-being in the profession, and we really appreciate you spreading that, because the more ambassadors we have that create and disseminate this work, the better profession we will have, and the better lawyers we will be, and the more effective the justice system will be. So there's that sort of that chain. So thank you all for tuning in, and thank you again, Professor Sanderson, for being here.
Take care.